The morning air over eastern England is still dark when the first engines cough into life. Not loudly at first, just a low mechanical rumble spreading across the concrete as if the ground itself has begun to vibrate. And at exactly 0520 on October 14, 1943, on airfields like Kimballton, Bossingbourne, Deanthorpe, and Thorpe Abbotts, thousands of American airmen are already awake, already dressed, already aware that today is different. Because this is not a routine mission, not a milk run, not even one of the hard days they have learned to endure. This is something heavier, something final in its intent, something that has been explained to them in stark briefings with no unnecessary words. A mission where fuel calculations leave no margin, where weather forecasts close doors instead of opening them, where turning back means failing entirely, where survival itself is conditional. Because today, the 8th Air Force is going back to Schweinfurt, and the men sitting in drafty briefing huts know exactly what that means. They remember August. They remember the burned aircraft limping home, the empty bunks, the missing crews, the silence that followed the debriefings. And now the maps on the wall show the same red line cutting deep into Germany, beyond fighter cover, beyond easy rescue, into the industrial heart of the Reich. And the target name is spoken again without embellishment. Schweinfurt, the center of German ball-bearing production, essential to tanks, aircraft, submarines, and artillery. A city that cannot be bypassed if the combined bomber offensive is to succeed. And the mission parameters are unambiguous. Daylight, precision bombing, no diversionary strike large enough to dilute German defenses, and a calculated acceptance of losses that every man in the room understands, but no one discusses aloud, because discussion would make it real, and reality is something they will face later, not now, not while the coffee is still hot and the engines are still warming, not while crew chiefs finish last checks and pilots run their hands over instrument panels they know by heart. Not while gunners joke quietly with the forced casualness of men who have learned that humor is a tool, not a luxury. And so the briefing ends, the words disperse, the mission settles into their bones, and by the time the sun begins to lift itself over the English countryside, the first B-17 flying fortresses are already rolling, heavy with fuel, heavy with bombs, heavy with the unspoken weight of the day ahead. Lifting slowly into the air in long, staggered lines, each aircraft clawing for altitude, each crew finding its place in the formation. Because formation is everything. Formation is survival. And as the bombers assemble into massive combat boxes over the North Sea, stretching for miles, the scale of the operation becomes visible. Hundreds of four-engine aircraft moving as one, silver against the pale sky, their contrails beginning to form thin white scars overhead. And inside each bomber, the crew settles into its stations, the pilot steady at the controls, the co-pilot scanning instruments, the navigator bent over charts, the bombardier checking the Nordensight, the radio operator monitoring frequencies, the gunners testing their weapons, all of them enclosed in aluminum and plexiglass, all of them dependent on one another, all of them aware that once they cross the enemy coast, options will vanish one by one. Because fuel has been calculated to the minute, because turning back early will mean landing short or ditching, because escort fighters will peel away at predetermined points, because the German fighter force will not. And as the English coastline falls behind and the gray expanse of the North Sea stretches out beneath them, the formations tighten, wings nearly overlapping, propellers churning cold air into turbulence that rattles bones and nerves alike, and the radio crackles with routine check-ins, voices calm, professional, trained to sound steady even when the mind is already racing ahead to the first flak burst, the first sight of enemy fighters, the first aircraft falling out of formation trailing smoke. And when the coast of occupied Europe finally appears on the horizon, a dark line against the water, there is a subtle shift inside every aircraft, a collective tightening, because this is the point of no return in spirit if not yet in distance. And the German early warning system has already seen them. Radar stations along the coast have plotted their course. Phone lines have carried the information inland. And somewhere deep inside Germany, fighter pilots are being scrambled. Flak crews are being ordered to their guns. Command staffs are tracing projected routes with pencils and calculating interception points because the Americans have come again in daylight, and the defenders know exactly where they are headed. And almost immediately after crossing the coast, the first black bursts of flak begin to appear. Distant at first, harmless-looking puffs that bloom and dissipate below the formation, but they are markers, adjustments, ranging shots, and within minutes the bursts climb, drawing closer, surrounding the bombers in expanding rings of black smoke that rock the aircraft with sharp concussive jolts, metal fragments clanging against fuselages, tearing holes in control surfaces, smashing windows, and inside the bombers, the crews brace instinctively. Hands tightening on guns, eyes scanning through plexiglass domes, because this is only the beginning, because the real danger has not yet arrived, and when the first German fighters finally appear, small, dark shapes rising from below, climbing fast, spreading out then converging, there is no confusion about what they are or why they are here. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, experienced pilots, well-coordinated, attacking with purpose, coming in head-on because they know the fortresses are most vulnerable from the front, where closing speeds compress seconds into heartbeats. And suddenly, the sky is alive with motion, fighters diving through the formation, cannon fire flashing, machine guns hammering, gunners tracking targets, firing short controlled bursts, brass casings clattering against metal floors, the aircraft shuddering under the combined stress of turbulence, flak, and enemy fire. And the radio fills with clipped calls, reports of fighters at 12 o'clock high, 6 o'clock low, 9 o'clock level. Voices overlapping, urgent but disciplined, because training takes over when fear has no room to breathe. And then the first bomber goes down, hit hard, engines aflame, slipping out of formation, rolling slowly before falling away. And the men in neighboring aircraft see it happen. They see parachutes, they see smoke, they see nothing at all, and they keep flying. Because stopping is impossible, because turning back is forbidden by fuel and by orders, because the formation must hold. And as the battle intensifies, the German fighters change tactics, attacking in waves, firing rockets that detonate inside the bomber formations, scattering shrapnel, forcing brief breaks in cohesion that are immediately exploited. And for every fighter driven off, another takes its place, and time stretches, minutes becoming hours, the cold seeping into fingers and faces at high altitude, oxygen masks frosting at the edges, breath sounding loud and mechanical in the ears, and the realization settles in gradually, inexorably, that this is not a passing engagement. This is sustained combat, a running gauntlet that will not end until the bombers reach their target or fall from the sky. And somewhere over central Germany, as escort fighters peel away one by one, their fuel exhausted, waggling wings in farewell before turning back, the bombers continue alone, deeper into hostile airspace. And the sense of isolation sharpens, because now there is nothing between them and the full weight of the German defense except their own guns and discipline. And the flak grows heavier, more accurate, bursting at precise altitudes, forming lethal boxes the bombers must fly through, the aircraft jolting violently, instruments flickering, hydraulic lines severed, engines coughing or failing outright, and still the formation presses on, because the target is close enough now to taste, because the orders are absolute. Bombs must be dropped. And as the navigators call out checkpoints, rivers, rail lines, cities sliding beneath them, the formation begins the long, slow turn onto the bomb run, a maneuver that feels like an eternity, because on the bomb run there can be no evasive action, no sudden changes in altitude or course, because the bomb site demands stability. And as the lead bombardier takes control of the aircraft through the Norden site, the entire formation becomes a single machine, following the lead, locked into a straight and level path that the German gunners have been waiting for. And the flak becomes almost continuous, black bursts erupting around the aircraft, some so close they seem to brush the wings. And inside the bombers, the men brace again, counting seconds, waiting for the call that will release them, waiting for the end of this particular stretch of hell. And yet, even now, even this deep, there is no thought of turning back, because turning back would mean abandoning the mission, wasting the losses already taken, admitting that the price paid so far was for nothing. And that is something neither the commanders nor the crews can accept. Not today. Not over Schweinfurt. And as the lead bombardier finally calls bombs away and the aircraft lurch upward as their loads fall free, there is a brief, almost surreal sense of relief. Because the mission's central task has been completed, because the bombs are falling toward the factories below, because for a fraction of a moment it feels as though the worst might be over. But that feeling does not last, because the German fighters are still there, because the flak does not stop just because the bombs are gone, because the journey home will be as dangerous as the approach. And as the formation begins to break off and reform for the withdrawal, damaged aircraft struggling to keep up, crews assessing wounds and system failures, radios crackling with distress calls, the reality of what has been lost begins to register. And as one more bomber, then another drops out of the sky, the survivors understand with a clarity that cuts through exhaustion and fear that the mission is not over. Not by a long measure, that the most dangerous moments may still lie ahead, and that for many of them, the true cost of a mission where turning back was not an option is only just beginning to reveal itself, as the German fighters regroup for yet another attack, and the long road west stretches out ahead, unforgiving, unavoidable, and far from finished. And far from finished, because almost immediately after that realization settles in, the surviving formations find themselves under renewed pressure as the German fighter controllers, having tracked the bombers through the target area, vector fresh grouping into position. Pilots who have waited on the ground or circled out of range now climbing aggressively to intercept aircraft that are wounded, disorganized, and no longer protected by the tight geometry of the inbound combat boxes. And the withdrawal from Schweinfurt begins not as a clean turn westward, but as a gradual unraveling, each group attempting to reform while simultaneously fending off attacks from every direction. And inside the bombers, the atmosphere changes in a subtle but profound way, because the bomb run with all its terror had a clear purpose and a defined end. But now there is only endurance, only the long sustained effort of staying alive long enough to reach friendly airspace. And the cold has deepened, frost spreading across interior surfaces, fingers numbing despite heated gloves, oxygen masks pressing painfully against faces that have already been tense for hours. And the men are tired in a way that goes beyond physical fatigue. Tired from concentration, from the constant scanning of the sky, from the repeated shock of flak bursts and cannon impacts, from the awareness that any lapse now, any moment of inattention, could be fatal. And as the formation pushes westward, the Germans press harder because they know this phase well. They know damaged bombers struggle to maintain speed and altitude. They know that guns may be jammed, crews wounded, coordination degraded. And so the attacks come from below and behind, from high sun angles, from blind spots. The fighters diving through the formation, firing, climbing away, regrouping, and coming again. And the gunners respond as they have been trained, calling out targets, firing in disciplined bursts, tracking closing shapes until they either break away or pass through in a blur of speed and noise. And sometimes the gunners see strikes, flashes on wings or fuselages, smoke trailing briefly before the fighter disappears. And sometimes they see nothing at all, just a sudden, violent shudder of their own aircraft as rounds tear through aluminum skin and internal structure. And one by one the damage accumulates, a hydraulic failure here, an engine feathered there, a radio shot out, an intercom line severed, forcing crew members to communicate by hand signals or shouted words that are barely audible over the roar of engines. And still, the bombers fly on, because stopping is impossible, because landing in Germany is unthinkable, because ditching over enemy territory offers no real hope, and the calculus that governs every decision is brutally simple. Keep moving west. Stay airborne. Stay together if you can. And if you cannot, survive as long as possible on your own. And as the hours pass, the air battle spreads across the sky in fragments, small groups of bombers strung out along the withdrawal route. Each one a separate fight, each one a separate test. And the German flak batteries inland continue to fire, though less densely now, bursts appearing sporadically, reminders that even as the fighters thin out, the ground defenses remain, and the landscape below slides by slowly. Fields and forests and towns that mean nothing to the men above except as markers of distance, indicators of progress. And somewhere along this route, crews begin to realize how far they have come and how far they still have to go, because fuel gauges are creeping downward, because engines damaged earlier are running hotter, rougher, threatening to fail at any moment, because wounded men are being tended to with limited supplies, because the radio operator listens for distress calls and hears more than he would like, aircraft reporting loss of power, loss of altitude, preparing to bail out, and then the calls stop, replaced by static, and no one says anything, because there is nothing to say. And as the bombers approach the point where escort fighters are scheduled to rejoin them, hope flickers cautiously, because P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings have extended their range as far as they can, and if they appear on time, they may blunt the worst of what is still coming. But the timing is critical because the German fighters are making a final concentrated effort, and for many bombers, those minutes will decide everything. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the escorts do appear, dark shapes against the sky, climbing to meet the formations, and the effect is immediate, because the German fighters break off some attacks, choosing new targets or disengaging entirely, and the American crews feel the pressure ease just slightly, not enough to relax, not enough to celebrate, but enough to breathe a little easier. And yet, even now, the danger does not vanish, because damaged bombers cannot always keep pace, because escorts cannot cover every aircraft at once, because fuel shortages force some fighters to turn back prematurely, leaving gaps that the Germans exploit without hesitation. And the withdrawal becomes a test of persistence rather than intensity, a grinding continuation of stress that wears down nerves and bodies alike. And inside the bombers, the passage of time becomes distorted, minutes blending together, the mind narrowing its focus to immediate tasks, maintaining formation position, scanning assigned sectors, monitoring engine temperatures, adjusting oxygen flow. And the realization grows that this mission has stretched far beyond anything most of these men have experienced before, not just in distance or duration, but in sustained exposure to danger. And as the formations finally near the German border, flak bursts begin to thin noticeably. The fighters appear less frequently, and for the first time since crossing the coast hours earlier, there is a sense, tentative and fragile, that survival may actually be possible. And yet that sense is undercut almost immediately by new problems, because fuel consumption has been higher than planned, because damaged aircraft have been forced to run engines at inefficient settings, because headwinds on the return leg have slowed progress, and the navigators begin recalculating, comparing remaining fuel to distance, factoring in altitude, weight, and engine condition, and the numbers are not comforting, and the phrase turning back has long since lost any meaning, because there is no back to turn to, only forward, only west, only the hope that the English coast will appear before the tanks run dry. And as the bombers cross back into occupied France, the sky begins to change, cloud layers thickening, visibility dropping, and while clouds offer some concealment from fighters, they also complicate navigation and formation keeping, and the bombers descend gradually, trading altitude for engine efficiency and oxygen independence. And as they do, the cold eases slightly, but fatigue deepens, muscles aching from hours of tension, eyes burning from constant strain, and the sense of vulnerability increases because lower altitude brings new threats, light flak, small arms fire near airfields and troop concentrations. And though these threats are less dramatic than the high-altitude defenses, they are no less dangerous to aircraft already on the edge of failure. And the withdrawal continues, mile after mile. And somewhere over northern France, one bomber finally loses an engine completely, the propeller windmilling uselessly, the aircraft dropping slightly before the pilot compensates. But the added drag is significant, speed bleeding away, and despite the crew's efforts, the aircraft begins to fall behind the formation. And everyone aboard knows what that means, because lone bombers attract fighters like blood in the water. And though escorts are still present, they cannot remain indefinitely. And the decision looms, whether to continue struggling westward or prepare to bail out while still over land. And these decisions are being made simultaneously in dozens of aircraft, each crew weighing their own situation, their own chances, their own responsibilities. And there is no single right answer, only the least bad option available in that moment. And as the hours wear on, the formations thin further, not just from losses, but from dispersion, aircraft spreading out as speed and altitude differences grow. And the radio traffic becomes quieter, not because the danger has ended, but because there is less coordination possible, fewer aircraft within range, fewer reasons to speak. And the silence itself becomes oppressive, broken only by engine noise and the occasional call reporting position or status. And then, at last, the coast of the English Channel begins to appear ahead, a faint line separating gray water from gray land. And for the first time since morning, a sense of relief washes through the crews, because the hardest part appears to be over, because friendly territory is close enough to see, because rescue is no longer theoretical. And yet, even now, the mission demands more, because fuel is critically low in many aircraft, because landing approaches will be tight, because damaged planes will need priority, because some crews may be forced to ditch in the channel just short of safety. And as the bombers cross the water, engines sputtering, gauges hovering near empty, the English coast grows clearer, fields and towns resolving into recognizable shapes, and the radio comes alive again. Control towers vectoring aircraft toward their bases, emergency procedures being activated, and the bombers begin to peel off toward their assigned airfields, each one descending carefully, because any mistake now could be fatal after all they have endured. And as the first aircraft touch down, tires screeching, brakes straining, crews slumped in their seats with exhaustion and relief, others are still in the air, still fighting failing engines, still calculating whether they can make it. And even as wheels meet runway, the mission is not over for everyone, because out over the channel, aircraft are still struggling, some losing power, some forced to ditch, crews climbing into life rafts in cold water hoping for rescue. And back at the airfields, ground crews count returning aircraft, marking down tail numbers, comparing them to the morning's lists, and the gaps become painfully obvious. And as the last bombers straggle in, some hours after the first, the full scale of the losses begins to emerge. But even then, even as the sun starts to dip toward the horizon, there is no sense of closure, because the mission's consequences are still unfolding, because men are still missing, because some aircraft have not yet been accounted for, because the question of whether the cost was worth it has not yet been answered. And in briefing rooms and command centers, officers begin assembling reports, analyzing damage assessments, loss figures, enemy response, and strategic impact, while on the flight lines, exhausted crews climb down from their aircraft, legs unsteady, faces drawn, some helped by medics, others standing alone, staring at bullet-middled fuselages and torn wings. And somewhere among them, the realization sets in that this mission has changed something fundamental, not just in the men who flew it, but in the way the air war itself will be fought. And yet that realization is incomplete, unresolved, because decisions have not yet been made, because lessons have not yet been fully understood, because the consequences of a mission where turning back was not an option are still rippling outward, still demanding answers. And as night falls over the English countryside, those answers remain just out of reach, hanging in the balance, waiting for the next step that will determine whether this day stands as a necessary sacrifice or a warning written in smoke and silence. Waiting for the next step that will determine whether this day stands as a necessary sacrifice or a warning written in smoke and silence. And that next step begins almost immediately, because exhaustion does not pause the war, because the men who survived October 14 do not wake the next morning to a world that has absorbed what happened, but to one that demands accounting, explanation, and continuation. And inside the 8th Air Force headquarters, the atmosphere is heavy, not with grief alone, but with uncertainty. Because the numbers coming in are stark and undeniable. Because the lists of missing aircraft grow longer with each updated report. Because crews are still being tallied hours after landing. And as intelligence officers compile loss figures, they begin to understand the scale of what has occurred. 60 B-17s lost outright, hundreds more damaged, entire crews killed, captured, or missing. And these are not abstract statistics. They are names, squadrons, bomb groups, men who had been present at breakfast that morning and are now absent from the mess halls and barracks. And among the surviving air crews, the sense of survival is complicated because relief exists alongside guilt, because every man knows someone who did not return, because the empty bunks are not theoretical, they are physical spaces that will remain unoccupied. And as medical officers treat frostbite, oxygen deprivation, flak wounds, and exhaustion, the crews are debriefed, asked to recount engagements that already feel unreal, asked to describe flak intensity, fighter tactics, escort effectiveness, asked to estimate damage to the target. And the answers come slowly, haltingly, because the men are tired, because memory under stress fragments, because no single crew saw the whole picture, only their own narrow slice of it. And as these fragments are assembled into a broader understanding, a troubling pattern emerges. Because the mission achieved its bombing objective, because bombs fell on Schweinfurt's industrial facilities, because some damage was inflicted, but not enough to cripple production for long, not enough to justify the cost in aircraft and men by the standards the planners had hoped for. And this realization does not come all at once. It creeps in through reports and assessments, through reconnaissance photos that show damaged buildings, but not the total devastation envisioned. And as analysts compare August's mission to October's, the conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Because the ball-bearing plants had dispersed production, because redundancy and repair capacity limited long-term impact, because the German war economy adapted more quickly than anticipated, and the pressure builds, not just among the crews, but among the commanders, because daylight precision bombing is the central American doctrine, because abandoning it would mean questioning years of training. Investment and belief. And yet the losses of October 14 challenged that doctrine in a way that cannot be ignored, because this mission went deep, because it went unescorted for long stretches, because it demonstrated the limits of current fighter range and the vulnerability of bomber formations without continuous protection. And as these conclusions begin to solidify, the men who flew the mission feel the weight of something beyond personal survival. They feel that they were part of a test, a trial by fire, whose results will shape decisions far above their level. And this knowledge adds another layer to their exhaustion, because it reframes their suffering as data, as evidence, as proof of something that may or may not change. And in the days that follow, as crews are given time to rest, to recover, to process what they endured, conversations shift from immediate danger to reflection. Not philosophical reflection, but practical, grounded questions about tactics, about escort fighters, about whether missions like this can continue. And these questions circulate quietly among enlisted men and officers alike, because no one wants to voice doubt too loudly, because morale matters, because the war demands confidence. But doubt exists nonetheless, because the memory of unescorted hours over Germany, of relentless fighter attacks, of watching aircraft fall away one after another, is too vivid to dismiss. And as the air war grinds on, these memories do not fade. They harden, becoming reference points against which future missions are judged. And this internal pressure reaches a breaking point not in dramatic confrontation, but in accumulation, because mission planners cannot ignore loss rates indefinitely, because replacement
replacement crews and aircraft cannot be trained and delivered fast enough to sustain operations at that cost, because public support, though distant from the details, is not infinite, and because the strategic necessity of bombing Germany remains absolute. And so the 8th Air Force finds itself at a crossroads, not marked by a single order or announcement, but by a growing consensus that something must change. And this consensus is informed directly by the experience of October 14, by the realization that bravery and formation discipline alone cannot overcome the physics of range and the reality of enemy defenses. And yet change does not come easily, because solutions are not immediately available, because long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang are only just entering service in limited numbers, because tactics must be tested, refined, proven. And in the meantime, the men continue to fly, because the war does not pause for doctrinal debates. And as new missions are launched, crews carry Schweinfurt with them, not as a single memory, but as a composite of moments. The first flak bursts, the head-on attacks, the hours without escort, the fuel gauges dropping toward empty, the long return over hostile territory. And these memories influence behavior in subtle ways. Gunners scanning a little harder, pilots holding formation a little tighter, navigators double-checking calculations, commanders weighing routes and targets with greater caution. And yet, despite these adjustments, the fundamental vulnerability remains until escorts can stay with the bombers from England to the target and back. And this reality creates a sense of near failure, not because the mission failed outright, but because it revealed the edge of what is currently possible. And living at that edge is unsustainable. And this sense permeates the organization, from headquarters to the flight line. And for the men who flew October 14, the days that follow are marked by a strange dissonance, because life resumes its routines, meals, briefings, maintenance schedules, while internally they are still over Germany, still counting seconds between flak bursts, still watching fighters close head-on. And this internal lag makes the present feel unreal, as though the body has returned but the mind is still catching up. And when the next mission briefings are posted, some men feel a tightening in the chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition, because they know what deep penetration missions cost, and they know that unless something has changed, the cost will be similar. And as the weeks progress, the 8th Air Force continues to strike, sometimes with escorts extended a little farther, sometimes with diversionary tactics, sometimes with altered routes. But the lessons of Schweinfurt linger, influencing every decision, and slowly, incrementally, the breaking point approaches. Not in a single catastrophic mission, but in the accumulation of losses that force a reevaluation. And this reevaluation is not a retreat from daylight bombing, but a recalibration, an acknowledgement that escort fighters must be prioritized, that bomber formations alone cannot dominate the skies indefinitely. And this realization marks a turning point in the air war, but it is not yet fully realized in October 1943. It is still forming, still contested, still incomplete. And for the men who lived through the mission where turning back was not an option, the story is not yet finished, because its consequences are still unfolding, because decisions are still being debated, because the future of the bomber offensive hangs in a delicate balance, poised between persistence and adaptation. And as winter approaches and new aircraft begin to arrive, the question remains unresolved, whether the sacrifices of Schweinfurt will be validated by change or repeated by necessity. And that question, heavy and unanswered, marks the true breaking point of the moment. Not a single instant in the sky, but a realization on the ground that the war in the air cannot continue as it has, and that what comes next will determine whether missions like October 14 become a grim pattern or a catalyst for transformation. And that transformation begins not with a single announcement, but with a series of decisions layered over weeks and months. Decisions informed directly by the cost paid on October 14, 1943. Because the Schweinfurt mission becomes a fixed reference point inside the 8th Air Force, cited in planning rooms, in memoranda, in quiet conversations between commanders who understand that the air war has reached a decisive phase. And as winter sets in over England, the operational tempo shifts, not because the bombing campaign is abandoned, but because it is recalibrated. And this recalibration reflects an acceptance of hard-earned reality, that daylight precision bombing deep into Germany cannot succeed consistently without continuous fighter escort. And so resources are redirected, escort doctrine refined, and aircraft development accelerated. And while these changes take shape, the men who survive Schweinfurt carry on with their duties, some completing their combat tours, others flying additional missions under evolving conditions. And the memory of that October day follows them, shaping expectations, sharpening judgment, reinforcing caution where bravado once filled the gaps. And as new long-range fighters begin to appear in greater numbers, particularly the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks that allow it to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back, the strategic picture begins to change in tangible ways, because German fighters now face sustained opposition, rather than brief encounters, because the bombers are no longer left alone for hours at a time, because the balance in the air begins to shift incrementally. And this shift is not immediate or absolute, but it is measurable, reflected in reduced loss rates, increased bombing accuracy, and a growing ability to strike critical industrial targets repeatedly rather than sporadically. And in retrospect, Schweinfurt stands as the moment when the limits of the old approach were exposed beyond denial, when the cost of proceeding without adaptation was made unmistakably clear. And as the bombing campaign continues into 1944, targeting oil facilities, transportation networks, aircraft factories, and other key nodes of the German war economy, the lessons learned from missions like October 14th are applied again and again, shaping routes, timing, escort assignments, and engagement tactics. And the men who plan these missions do so with an awareness forged by experience rather than theory, and the crews who fly them benefit, whether they know it or not, from decisions made in response to Schweinfurt's losses. And yet, for those who were there, who flew through the flak and fighters on that specific day, the meaning of the mission is personal as well as strategic.
Because they remember the faces of men who did not return, because they remember the sound of engines faltering, the sight of parachutes against the sky, the feeling of fuel gauges dropping toward empty. And these memories are not abstract contributions to doctrine. They are lived experiences that remain long after the war moves on to new phases. And as the months pass and the invasion of Western Europe approaches, the air war intensifies rather than diminishes, but it does so with a different balance of power, one increasingly favorable to the Allies. And this balance is built in part on the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths revealed by missions like Schweinfurt, truths about vulnerability, about the necessity of protection, about the limits of endurance. And when the war eventually ends and the scale of the air campaign is assessed in full, October 14, 1943 is recognized not simply as a costly mission, but as a pivotal one, a moment when persistence collided with reality and forced change. And in official histories, after-action reports, and veteran recollections, Schweinfurt occupies a distinct place, remembered for its bravery, its losses, and its impact. And for the men who flew that day, the mission resolves not in triumph or defeat alone, but in survival and consequence, because they returned to England carrying proof of what could and could not be done, proof written in damaged aircraft, empty bunks, and altered plans. And as the 8th Air Force continues its work, contributing decisively to the weakening of German industry, the destruction of the Luftwaffe, and the success of Allied ground operations, the shadow of Schweinfurt remains part of that story, not as an isolated tragedy, but as a turning point that helps shape a more effective and sustainable strategy. And in that sense, the mission where turning back was not an option achieves a resolution that extends beyond the moment itself, because its outcome is measured not only in bombs dropped or aircraft lost, but in the decisions it compelled, the adaptations it accelerated, and the lives it ultimately helped save by forcing a reckoning with reality. And when history looks back on that October morning, it sees not just a formation of bombers heading east into danger, but a moment when the course of the air war was bent by experience, endurance, and the unwillingness to ignore the cost of pressing forward without change. And so the story concludes not with a single dramatic image, but with an understanding,
earned at great expense, that the path to victory in the air required not only courage, but learning, adaptation, and the resolve to act on hard truths revealed in the skies over Germany.